Tristan Talks Family. How are we doing? This video is going to be, I think it's going to be right back to back, blah, 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 blah. But today we're going to be talking about are prisons obsolete and should prisons exist? Might be controversial. But I've just finished this book by Angela Davis, Are Prisons Obsolete? And I found it very interesting. And I found it very provoking. That's a big word for Elma. But it's not long. It's about 116 pages. It took me about, I read a chapter a day, and there's 5 chapters, so it took me 5 days. I could have read it in a day, but I didn't want to. There's 6 chapters. 6 chapters, and it took me 6 days. And it's good. It's real good. I finished it on the train on my way to Raleigh. I liked it. So I'm going to be talking about it. I'm going to be analyzing mostly every chapter. And it might be a pretty long video, but sit down. Go do your homework or something, or clean up your room, take a shower, because some of y'all, musty March, some of y'all, I'm not playing. But what if I told you that the most thing people take for granted is that the idea we need prisons? But it is actually one of the most contested, most dangerous assumptions in modern society. That's a question. Not because prisons don't exist, and indeed they do. The United States have locked up more people than any country on earth. Over 2 million human beings sitting in cages right now. But the real question isn't whether prisons exist. The question is, I don't know. That's what we're unpacking today. We're trying to figure out what the question is. But the question is, title card, are prisons obsolete? Asked by Angela Davis. And the deeper you go into this book, the more you realize that's not a radical question. It's not a radical thought. It's actually the most rational thing you could be asking. We could be asking. So we're going to break down this book. It was written in 2003, chapter by chapter, and I'm going to give you the arguments, the history, the data, and the real talk context, so you can form your own view. Whether you're skeptical, or whether you're already on board, or whether you never even thought about abolition. But stay with me. Y'all got to trust me. But this is going to change the way you see things, in my opinion. Before we get into chapters, let me give you a quick little bio on Angela Davis if you do not know her, because context actually matters. Angela Davis is a scholar, activist, and a professor who has been one of the most important voices in American radical politics since the 1970s. She was on the FBI's most wanted list, and she was acquitted of all charges after a highly politicized trial. If you've done some research on history, you know the Angela Davis trial. She spent her entire career studying the intersections of race, gender, and capitalism in the prison system. This book, Are Prisons Obsolete, was published in 2003, as I said before, and it reads like a manifesto. It's like a history lesson or a philosophical challenge all in one. The book has 6 chapters, as I said previously, and each one builds upon the last. By the end, Davis isn't just asking whether we should abolish prisons. She's asking what kind of society we want to live in. So let's dive. Let me hop in that ocean. So the introduction, it says abolition now. The first chapter is titled Introduction, which reads like a thesis statement. For the entire book, Davis opens by doing something really deliberate. She compares abolishing prison to abolishing slavery. She says, most people before the abolition movement gained momentum couldn't imagine a world without slavery. It was so embedded in the economy and culture and everyday life that it seemed permanent, unquestionable, natural. And Davis argues that prisons occupy the same psychological space for us today. So we don't question prisons, though, as they question slavery. When someone commits a crime, we say lock them up, and without ever asking, does that actually work? Does it make the society safer? Does it actually address the root causes of crime? Or does it benefit anyone besides the people profiting from it? Ooh, gotta take a sip of water on that one. This is gonna be a long video. But the key arguments here that Davis is arguing is that in chapter 1 is that the prison industrial complex has become so normalized that we can't see it for what it is. A massive racialized system of social control that functions more as a way to warehouse poor blacks and brown people, and then to Lord, that's a big word, Filma. Rehabilitate anyone or protect communities. She points out that the United States has experienced explosive prison growth since the 1970s. In the 1970s, or in 1970, there were roughly 200,000 people incarcerated in America. By 2003, when the book was published, the number had exploded past 2 million. Today, it's even higher when you include jails, immigration detention, and juvenile factories. Davis is clear that the explosion is not expanded by a sudden rise in criminality. It's expanded by policy. The war on drugs, I'm going to post a different video before this that talks about the war on drugs. My videos, they all intersect. Mandatory minimums are mandatory quotas. The 3 strike laws, broken window policies, these were political choices. And they were overwhelmingly targeting who? Black and Latino communities. One of the most powerful rhetorical moves Davis makes in the chapter is asking us to imagine alternatives. She says we can't build a better future if we can't imagine it. And she asks, what does it mean to take seriously the question of abolition? Not just prison reform, not just fix the prisons, but abolition. Getting rid of the cage as the default response to social harm. She's not saying crime doesn't exist, and when it obviously does, and she's not saying harm doesn't exist. She's saying our response to harm, locking millions in cages, is not working, and we need to start from scratch in our thinking. But here's my take. What Davis is doing in this chapter is the intellectual equivalent of unplugging the matrix. She's asking you to question so fundamental that most people never even pause to question it. And that's where the discomfort comes from. Once you start asking, is this necessary? You can't unask it. Whether you believe prisons should be abolished or not, the first step is being willing to examine them honestly. And most of us has never done that. Davis forces this examination. I'm going to be real. I have never done that. But we're going to get into why I have never done that. Chapter 2. She talks about slavery, civil rights, and punishment. Chapter 2 is like a history lesson, and honestly, this might be the most important chapter in the book for the people who don't know this history. Davis traces a direct line from slavery to modern prison system. This isn't just a metaphor. Isn't that's a big word for him. She isn't pointing to actual legal and structural continuities between these two systems. The 13th Amendment, me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of the 13th Amendment if you watch my other videos. But here's something that needs to be said clearly because a lot of people don't know this about the 13th Amendment. The actual text of the 13th Amendment says, I'm going to read it word for word, neither nor slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States. The word except is doing enormous work here. It means we abolish slavery unless you're a convicted criminal. And immediately after the Civil War, Southern states used this loophole aggressively. They passed what they were called black codes, laws that criminalized things like standing on a street corner, being unemployed, or being out past sundown without documentation. Formerly enslaved black people were arrested under the laws en masse and then leased out to plantations and businesses under the convict leasing system. Davis is ambiguous about this. Convict leasing was slavery by another name. The people doing the labor were disproportionately black. The profits went to private businesses in the state. The conditions were brutal, and the legal mechanism was incarceration rather than chattel ownership. But the lived reality was functionally the same. Davis walks us through this political history too. She talks about the Reconstruction, the post-Civil War era where black people briefly gained political power, lands, and rights. I have up there the first black Congress. First all-black Congress in South Carolina. First black congressman was Hiram Rhodes Rebel. I think I said that right, but Rhodes Rebels. Where was I? But by 1877, the federal troops were withdrawn from the South. And what followed was Jim Crow, lynching and disenfranchisement, and convict leasing. She argues this creates a template wherein when black political and social progress threatens the racial hierarchy, the criminal justice system expands as a tool of suppression. You can draw the same line from Reconstruction backlash to the post-civil rights era backlash that produced the war on drugs and mass incarceration. But Davis also gets into something deeper. Who gets labeled as a criminal and why? She points out the way that crime and blackness has become fused into the American cultural imagination, not because black people are more criminal, and indeed they are not. But because media, politics, and policy make it seem that way. She cites the way films like Birth of the Nation portray black men as sexual predators and criminals. She traces out politicians from Barry Goldwater, who said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, through Nixon, through Reagan, who used coded racial language, law and order, welfare queens, super predators, to build political coalitions around the fear of black crime. This is important because Davis is saying that the mass incarceration wasn't an accident. It was a strategy, a political project built on racial fear. But my takeaway is, and there will be a takeaway for every chapter, is that when I read this chapter, the most important thing for me was understanding that the prison system in America was never designed to be race neutral. It was designed within and through a racial order. If you want people to understand why black people are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white people in this country, you need the history. Not because it's comfortable, because it's true. Understand that the past doesn't trap us in it, but misunderstanding the past keeps us reproducing it. Chapter 3 is when she's talking about women and punishment. Chapter 3 is where Angela Davis opens the lens wide. The previous chapter were largely about men, about the dominant narrative of mass incarceration. Here she turns to women. And what she reveals is both unique and deeply illuminating. The incarceration of women in America has grown even faster than that of men since the 1980s. Davis argues that women's experience in prisons are distinct, shaped not just by race and class, but also by gender. And the feminist analysis is all absolutely essential to understanding this prison system. Davis begins by noticing how invisible incarcerated women are in public discourse. The prison crisis is usually talked about as a crisis affecting men, but women are one of the most fast and growing prison populations, and their pathways into incarceration are often distinct. Many women who end up incarcerated have histories of domestic abuse, sexual assault, and childhood trauma. A significant number are incarcerated from nonviolent drug offenses or economic crimes related to poverty. Davis argues that the prison system takes women who are already victims of patriarchal violence and subjects them to new forms of institutional violence. Water break. But this chapter is unflinching about sexual abuse inside women's prisons. Davis documents widespread patterns of sexual abuse by guards and staff, a form of state-sanctioned violence that often goes unpunished. She argues that for incarcerated women, sexual assault or sexual violence is not incidental to the prison experience. It is structurally embedded into it. She connects this to broader history of how black and other women of color have been treated by the state as bodies whose sexuality and safety don't matter, as people whose suffering doesn't rise to the level of public concern. The prison becomes one more institution in a long line of institutions that treats these women as expandable. I remember I was reading something on an article, and this guy, a judge in Florida, was like he's going to ban vaccines because they're bad for you, or whatever that means. But the same people who voted on to take away Roe v. Wade are now saying my body, my choice because they don't want to get a vaccine. I just work here. But Davis also makes an argument that's particularly interesting from a feminist theory standpoint. She knows that feminist movements has often been complicit in expanding the criminal justice system, advocating for harsher penalties for domestic violence, rape, and trafficking without questioning whether criminalization and incarceration actually help survivors. This is a nuanced point. She's not saying that domestic violence isn't serious. She's asking, does arresting and imprisoning abusers actually work for women? Actually make women safer, sorry. Does it address the conditions such as poverty, gender hierarchy, and lack of support that produce abuse? Her answer is not really, and it may actually put women in more danger, particularly women of color, whose partners may be targeted by a racist criminal justice system. But in this chapter, what hit me the hardest is how Davis refuses to let the conversation about prisons be a conversation about black men. Incarcerated women, particularly black men and Native American women, are among the most invisible people in America. They're locked up, they're abused, and almost nobody is talking about it at a big scale, as if they're talking about incarcerated black men. Davis is insisting that abolitionist framework has to center around the woman's experiences. You can't build just an alternative to prisons if half the incarcerated population is invisible in your analysis. How do gender structures the prison system? Chapter 4. It goes even deeper into gender, but this time it expands into the analysis to think about masculinity, femininity, I think I said that right, and queerness interact with the prison system as a whole. This chapter in many ways is the most theoretically dense. It's the most longest chapter, I think, of the 6 chapters, but also one of the most revelatory. Davis argues that the prisons are not just racial institutions. They are also deeply gendered institutions that reinforce specific violent norms of masculinity and femininity. Davis examines how men's prison systems are organized around a particular form of toxic, violent masculinity. The culture inside men's prisons is hierarchical, brutal, and hyper-masculine because it has to be. When you strip people of almost everything, their freedom, their family connections, their autonomy, their economic identity, what's left? In a society that teaches men their worth comes from dominance, prison creates the conditions for extreme violence as a survival strategy. She connects this to the patterns of masculinity in American culture and argues that the prison doesn't rehabilitate men, it traumatizes them in ways that often make it harder to function in society after release. This stat supports this. The recidivism, that's a big word for Elmo. Most people who come out of prison end up back within a few years. The prison system is producing the very conditions that lead back into prison. She also talks about queer people. Davis examines what happens to LGBTQ plus people, especially transgender women, inside men's prisons. Trans women who are incarcerated in men's facilities face extraordinary rates of sexual assault. They are placed in solitary confinement for their protection, which means that the prison's response to their vulnerability is to punish them with isolation. Davis frames this not as an unintended consequence, but as a product of a system that cannot accommodate bodies and identities that don't fit into the rigid gender binary, male and female. She argues that the prison, by design, enforce gender conformity through violence, and that any serious critique of the prison system has to include a critique of these enforced gender norms. And she also talks about feminism and abolition. She argues that feminism and prison abolition are not separate causes, they are the same cause. She says the same patriarchal logic that justifies violence against women justifies the violence of incarceration. The same dehumanization, the same notion that certain bodies can be controlled, confined, and punished without consequence. If you're against gender violence, you should be against prison violence. If you believe in human dignity for women, you should believe in human dignity for incarcerated people. But this chapter that convinces me, this chapter that Davis is right, it's because it convinces me of the abolitionist framework. Abolitionist framework is not just about prisons in isolation. It's a critique of interlocking systems of domination, racism, patriarchy, capitalism. She's saying you can't dismantle one without addressing the others. Even if you're not a socialist or a radical feminist, you can engage with the specific empirical claims she's making. Are prisons making us safer? Are they rehabilitating people? Are they worth the cost? On the evidence, the answers are not encouraging. The answers are not encouraging at all. And they're not what you think. But she also, chapter 5, let's go into chapter 5. We're almost done. The prison industrial complex. Chapter 5 is the chapter where most people who've heard of this book, this is the chapter they know about, even if they haven't read it. This is where Davis talks about the prison industrial complex. In chapter 2, she gave us a historical foundation, and chapter 5 gave us an economic analysis. Davis defines the prison industrial complex as the overlapping interests of government, corporations, media, political institutions that benefit from the expansion of incarceration. It's a term modeled on Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. The idea that some industries are dependent on a particular system, that they have a financial interest in its continuation and growth. So who profits from these prisons? Private prison corporations like CoreCivic, formerly CCA, or GEO Group, lobby for longer sentences, stricter drug laws, and harsher immigration enforcement because their revenue depends on keeping beds full in the prison. They don't make money on rehabilitation or release, they make money on incarceration. Lock in. Phone companies charge incarcerated people and their families outrageous rates, sometimes $14 a minute for collect calls, because prisons granted them exclusive contracts and took a cut of the revenue. That families, larger poor families, larger black and Latino families, being bled financially just to stay in contact with their loved one. Food service companies, medical contractors, commissionary vendors, transportation companies. There was an entire ecosystem of corporations that makes billions of dollars off of human captivity. Davis is saying that this system has its own logic, its own momentum. It grows not because it's working, but because it's profitable. It's not easy. Why are there so many prisons? I often question, why is there a prison by every train I've been on? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out. But Davis also examines how prisons became economic anchors for rural, predominantly white communities. As manufacturing declined in the 1970s and 80s, more rural towns fought economic devastation. Prisons came in the fray as recession-proof employers. They brought construction jobs, correction officer jobs, and administration jobs. And so you had this bizarre solution. Black and Latino men from urban areas were being shipped to rural white communities where their incarceration became the economic engine of these communities. Just how in Alabama, I read it's like $400 billion contribute to Alabama from prison labor. Yo, look, I got a cut. Shout out Nico Cuts. Where was I? Somebody let me know. But the people being locked up and the people profiting from locking them up were geographically and racially distinct populations. Davis points out the political implications. Those rural communities became powerful advocates for keeping prisons open and expanding them, creating a political constitution, political base or political fan base, if you want to call it, for mass incarceration. But chapter 5, she also talks about how media shapes attitudes toward crime and punishment. She examines the explosion of crime dramas and reality cop shows and news coverage that reinforced the association of blackness with criminality throughout the 1980s and 90s. When the evening news led with the mugshot every night, when every cop show depicts black men as their default suspect, when the entire culture is saturated with images linking race and crime, public support for mass incarceration doesn't need to be expanded due conscious racism. It gets built into the cultural wallpaper. What Davis is saying in this chapter, and what is she exposing in this chapter, is that something that should outrage everyone regardless of political affiliation, a system that is more interested in profit than justice. If prisons existed to reduce crime, we would see investment in rehabilitations into institutions. We'd see treatment instead of punishment for addiction. We see education, mental health, support, job training. Instead, we see record profits for private prison companies and record rates of recidivism. Hold on, give me a second. I'm not editing this out. No, I'm not.
Recidivism.
Recidivism. It's a big word for him, though. The prison industrial complex is not a conspiracy theory. It's a business model. And when you understand that, the failure to reform the system makes a lot more sense. Reform threatens the profit margin. Last chapter, abolitionist alternatives. This is the chapter where people expect Davis to hand you a utopian blueprint because the liberals will say, once you take down the fascists, will your revolution give rights to the fascists? Will you have civil liberties for the fascists? Did they have civil liberties and rights for us? Why does the revolution have to be perfect all of a sudden? And with this utopian blueprint, they say, she deliberately refuses to do that. Chapter 6 is titled Abolitionist Alternatives, and it's more about reorienting our imagination than providing a policy checklist. But don't misread that as a dodge. Davis has real concrete proposals, and the framework she also offers is one of the most intellectually serious approaches to criminal justice system I've ever encountered. The first thing Davis insists on is abolition does not mean we do nothing about harm. This is the most common understanding, and she anticipates it directly. People say, okay, so someone commits murder. You just want me to let them go, or you just want to let them go? What about the victims? That is not what abolition means. Davis is arguing for the dismantlement of the current system alongside the construction of alternative institutions. Institutions that actually address the root causes of harms, actually support victims, and actually reduce violence and crime rather than recycling it. What does Davis actually oppose? She opposes a few key frameworks like the demilitarization of schools. She argues for removing police from schools and investing in counselors, mental health workers. The school-to-prison pipeline runs directly through the criminalization of student behavior. Black children are suspended and expelled at dramatically higher rates, often same behaviors that white children face no consequences for. This pipeline needs to be dismantled. I know myself, I've had many in elementary school, I had many times where me and this white kid were doing the same shit and I got in more trouble. Hold on, let me tell you a little story. I was in my, I think it was 4th grade, I was in class and we were watching a movie and I was talking during the movie and this white girl was like, she was telling the teacher, who was like, can you tell Tristan to stop talking? He's interrupting us. I was a badass little kid. I don't give a fuck. And she was like, he's gonna end up in jail anyway. It was me and my boys. We was like 3 of us. They're gonna end up in jail anyway. We're all black. I'm like, first, I just laughed it off because I'm in 4th grade. I didn't know what it meant. But I started to think about it once I got older. I was like, this is the same shit that Davis is writing about. Davis also talks about healthcare as a right. Davis argues that much of what ends up in prisons are untreated. Mental illness and addiction, for example. If the United States had universal mental health care and addiction treatment, a huge portion of that behavior currently lands in people in prison would be addressed at that source. She also talks about restorative and transformative justice. Davis points to traditions of restorative justice. Processes focus on repairing harm, bringing together people who caused the harm with the people they harmed, and creating community accountability as genuine alternatives to incarceration for many categories of offense. She also talks about economic injustice. Davis makes this point clearly that poverty drives crime, not because poor people are morally inferior, but because unmet material needs create conditions of desperation. A genuine commitment to affordable housing, living wages, quality public education, and economic opportunity would reduce crime far more than any number of prisons. And she also talks about decarceration and decriminalization. Davis advocates for decriminalizing drugs, reducing mandatory minimums, ending cash bail, and creating paths out of the system for people currently inside of it. Not because people who caused harm deserve no accountability, but because the current system creates far more harm than it prevents. The deeper challenge in this chapter is Davis calls for imagination. She says we cannot tinker at the margins of the system. We have to imagine, seriously imagine, and rigorously question what a society organized around human flourishing rather than punishment would look like. She invokes the tradition of utopian thinking, but as a necessary political act. Every great social transformation required people to first imagine something that didn't exist yet. The abolitionists imagined a world without slavery. It was all around them. When it was all around them. Suffragists imagined women voting when the law said no. Civil rights leaders imagined desegregation in the teeth of apartheid or hate. Davis is asking you to do the same imaginative work today, not to expect it to happen overnight, but to refuse to limit our vision to the horizons of the current system. This chapter that challenges me most personally, because it's easy to critique a broken system. It's harder to hold space for someone or something, for building something genuinely different. But what Davis convinced me, we already have evidence that alternatives work. Countries with stronger social safety nets, mental health infrastructure, education investment, drug decriminalization have dramatically lower incarceration rates and lower crime rates than the United States. This isn't speculative. This is happening in Scandinavia and Portugal and Germany. We are not choosing between prisons and chaos. We are choosing between a system that is failing and alternatives that have already been proven. That is the argument Davis is making, and she makes it very well. We've been through these 6 chapters, and I'm going to give my last thoughts on this. Angela Davis is not asking you to be naive about violence and harm. She's asking you to be honest whether the prison system is actually addressing those things, or whether it's warehousing people, traumatizing them, and profiting from their misery, and reproducing the very conditions that produce harm in the first place. When you look at the data, the answer is troubling. 70% of people released from prisons are rearrested in 5 years. The United States spend over $80 billion a year on incarceration, and then they tell you we don't have enough money to feed the children. We lock up more people than China, Russia, and any other nation on this earth, and every major metric, public safety, racial equity, rehabilitation costs. The system is failing. Davis is authoring something different, not a fully formed blueprint, not a naive dream, a rigorous, historically grounded argument that the cage as a default response to social harm is obsolete. And that we owe it to ourselves and to the 2 million people. The numbers is way higher than it was in 2003. To think seriously about what comes next. And here's what I want you to think. Well, I want to hear from you. It's called Tristan Talks. That means I'm here to talk, and that means you can talk too. Like, hit the comment section, bro. Do you think prisons are obsolete? Where do you agree with Davis, and where do you push back? Drop the thoughts in the comments. I will read every single one of them. If you wanted to go deeper, the book is 116 pages. It's not that hard to read, and you can finish it in a day, or you can read each chapter a day. All right, that's all I had. This is Tristan Talks. Stay critical, stay curious. See ya.